Welcome to Giborim Podcast. This episode is in honor of our fallen as we commemorate Yom HaZikaron here in Israel. Yom HaZikaron is the Israeli day to remember our heroes who fell in battle defending our beautiful country. This year I was invited to talk about my heroes, Yair Katz, Zechariah Pesach Haber, and Netzer Simchi. May their memory be a blessing. It's weird to say it, but it's truly an honor to be here. Zchut Shlomo in this holy community, and to be accompanied by my wonderful friends here, Yair Katz, Zechariah Pesach Haber. I only learned the middle name after he passed away, and Netzer Simchi. I was thinking about something to share connected to the Tzfirah, and I thought of this pasuk, which for me helps me understand a little bit more about the Tzfirah and also about the shofar. And the pasuk goes like this. It's from Sefer Ezra. Ve'ein ha'am mekirim kol turat ha'simcha lekol bechi ha'am ki ha'am mari'im tu'ah gdola ve'akol nishma ad lemerachok. After they built the second Beit HaMikdash, it wasn't as glamorous as the first Beit HaMikdash had been, at least at that stage. And the old-timers that remembered what it looked like in the first Beit HaMikdash were crying tears of sadness. And at the same moment, the younger generation were ecstatic and cheering. And then the pasuk tells us that the nation couldn't distinguish between the blast of the sound of happiness and the sound of crying of the nation, because the nation was blasting a tuah gdola, and that sound was heard until very far away. The Malbim tells us here that one explanation of the pasuk, and there are many, says that the kol shofar overcame the two voices, the one of happiness and the one of sadness. And that was the only voice that was heard. And when I hear the tzfirah, part of me hears, maybe on a day like today, that we're leaning towards the kol habechi, the sound of crying, the sound of sadness and hurt and pain and torture. But there's also an element of it in happiness. And as I tell about these three tzaddikim behind me, I want to keep that in mind. I'm going to start with Yair, all the way to my left, Yair Katz. Yair was, of the three, I knew him the longest. I knew him since I drafted to the army. He was 18 then, I was 23. I was ancient considering the Army's draft. And Yair was this scrawny, young 18-year-old from Cholon. And I don't think we connected so much at first. We just had a world of difference between him and a language barrier that eventually we could overcome somewhat. And Yair had this simplicity in the most beautiful sense of the word to him. He was, at one point, he was a chozer b'tshuva. He became a full-on Breslover. And he approached that also with such sweet happiness and sweet simplicity. Afterwards, he mellowed out a little bit, and his Judaism was very central to him. Maybe not as much as in practice, but it was very much front and center. And Yair was just a person you could sit with and have simple conversation or deep conversation or no conversation. It's a very special type of friend to have. You can sit there in total silence and he's in no rush. He's just there. And he had a very sensitive soul towards, you wouldn't know it at first. He started off scrawny very quickly. He became this huge, muscular, scary figure who was soft as you can imagine. And he had tremendous sensitivity towards animals, and he actually adopted a pit bull that was in fights in East Jerusalem with our not so dear cousins, and eventually he was able to adopt this pit bull, which he named Bruce. Don't know why. And he had this sweet relationship with all animals, and everywhere we went throughout the war, he was adopting more animals along the side. And I was always, yelling at him, being like, enough of the animals, get him away from here. But he didn't care. He just did what he had to do. And that was Yair. He had this sweet simplicity to him. He was a driver of a tank that was led by our deputy company commander, and he was joined in his team with Zechariah. Both Zechariah and Yair had a tremendous middot of being slow to anger. I think Zechariah didn't have any anger whatsoever in him. I know because I pushed him. I tried to get him angry a couple of times, and I was unsuccessful. If you ever want to feel unaccomplished with where your life's at, take a look at what Zechariah did. Zechariah, today was his Zuckerberg birthday, as Rav Shlomo likes to say. He would have turned 33 years old. And he was an Abba of 3, and he was married to Talia, and they had 3 young, beautiful children. Still has. And I knew Zechariah for about the last 10 years, more or less. Some things you discover about somebody after they pass, and it ma'id ala kol, it shows you everything. So Zechariah was a Talmid Chacham. He was a wonderful father. He was a wonderful husband. He was a scientist, about to make potentially a big impact on the world. And he was a Talmid Chacham. And he studied at Yeshivat Agush, not far from here. And his father discovered after he passed away on his computer, I guess he found it, basically a kuntus. It was like a 150-page, something like that, document of all his studies. He had done a summary of everything he had learned and added in his own insights along the way. His insights speak also about it. His insights are small, they're short. He doesn't want to take away from the text. Not from a lack of understanding, but like a lack of a desire to pollute with his own opinion. It's Zechariah. And if you go on YouTube, you can find, I don't know, about a dozen shiurim that he gave over on different topics. His father had no idea about it. His mother had no idea about it. It's not something he would show off. It's not something he would share unless prompted to. On top of it, he was in the midst of he's pretty close to finishing his PhD, and he didn't talk about it a lot, but he was studying the effect of growing wheat in the desert. You can imagine something that would have such a global impact, but that's what he was working on. I once had a conversation with him about business, and he just asked, he's like, why would anybody do something that didn't have meaning and impact on the world? It wasn't going to make the world a better place. He couldn't understand. One time I got angry at Yair and Zechariah. That's something you have to be in a company with people for 140 days in order to realize what you get angry about. But I didn't like how they left the tank that I was taking over from them. And I ran up to them and I was, yelling at them, probably foaming at the mouth with all the anger I had towards them in that moment because they had left it in conditions that I was not happy with. And Yair, in typical fashion, tried to explain it for a second, gave a little bit of resistance, but then backed away because he didn't feel like getting into an argument. And I almost saw Zechariah get angry. Almost. It looked like this. We talk about in Tanya, about the moach shalit al halev. For Zechariah, it wasn't a control. He took that anger that arose from his heart to his head, and he exploded it and let it out in a puff. that was as much as Zechariah ever got angry. I told the story to his parents and to his wife, and all of them commented the same thing. Talia, his wife, said, whenever we would get in a fight, he never would get angry. Ever. He never yelled at the kids. He would, when we'd get in a fight, is what she said, they would sit down, and Zechariah would make sure there'd be food at the table. We'd eat, and then Zechariah would say, let's talk about what happened. His parents said the same thing. I don't think I ever saw him get angry. So these two wonderful souls lead me to tell another story about somebody who is alive and well, and that's Boaz. But in order to get there, I have to tell a painful story about Yair and Zechariah. A few months ago, before that, I'll say something else. On the morning of the same day that Yair and Zechariah were killed, they both woke up early before Alad Tadmor, who's their deputy company commander, who's the commander of their tank, who's an amazing individual in and of himself, and Adi, who's also incredible. Adi was 23, Yair was 36, and they became little brother, big brother. Friends doesn't describe what they had between them, and they did everything. In fact, it was hard to have a conversation with Yair because Adi, who was more talkative, would always answer for Yair. But that morning, Zechariah and Yair woke up before the rest of the team. Instead of Adi and Yair going out and buying food for the team, because they were outside of Gaza at that moment, Zechariah and Yair went out and bought an extravagant breakfast for those times. I think even with coffee from a store, something really impressive at that time, and brought it back to share with the team. And that morning, when the team was sitting down, Tadmor, the deputy company commander, Adi, Yair, and Zechariah, Tadmor and Adi kept on trying to figure out who to pay back. So they went to Yair and they said, Yair, who should we give money to? Did you pay for it or did Zechariah? And Yair said, no, Zechariah. They went to Zechariah separately and they said, Zechariah, we understand from Yair that we owe you some money. Here's money, take. He goes, no, pay back Yair. It's like mamash the story of why the Beit HaMikdash, the Midrash, it tells us about why the Beit HaMikdash was built in that one place. So between these people, between this amazing love between these team members, the one with 3 children and a wife, and the one who was single and unmarried, the same story repeats itself as we see. In the moment that they were both killed, I was there also, but we were in a convoy of a number of tanks. I won't go into the whole story, because I don't think that's the purpose of these days. I know it's a tendency to tell the stories, and there's an element to it, but I think the depth lies in between the stories, maybe. Anyways, in that moment, their tank was hit, and Yair was immediately killed, and Zechariah was injured very badly and was between life and death. And the tank was not functioning. Boaz, who was in the leading tank, jumped out of the tank. And again, this is moments before an RPG was fired, and we don't know where the enemy is. And he jumps off of his tank. And Boaz himself is a commander, but he functions as a loader. And he ran off in the wide open with no protection and jumped onto Yair and Zechariah's tank and took stock of what was going on inside, and he saw that Tadmor was very badly injured. Very badly injured. He had 3 grenades blew up on his back, and he was still functioning, but he was hardly there. And he was able to explain what had happened to him, but he was badly hurt. And Boaz made sure that he was able to evacuate Tadmor first to the next tank to get treatment. And he came inside and saw the state of Zechariah, saw the state of Yair, and he saw that Adi was also there, and he was injured very badly also in his leg. And Boaz orchestrated the most time-conscious, effective, perfect evacuation possible. And he saved Tadmor's life. Boaz is also a Bal Midot. And on top of saving Tadmor's life, he was there with Adi, as Adi was trapped inside a tank, amongst a brutal scene, and he was comforting Adi the entire time, and enabled for Adi to get out also. Adi, of course, waited to be the last one to get out, wanted to make sure everybody else got out first. Balei midot, atzumot, these people with incredible midot. And Boaz, nevertheless, he knew Boaz, of course, thinking he could always have done more, beat himself over it. As we tell him, we watched you, every moment was calculated. You did it perfectly. But that's Am Yisrael. Shortly after Zechariah and Yair were killed, we had another event in our company where actually David Kucherenko, who's from Batayan, was injured pretty badly. He's still got a road to recovery ahead of him. And what had happened was there were a number of teams outside of their tanks, and one of the Yimach Shabamim was up and fired an RPG, and it hit the tank. The shrapnel went into David's leg, and David was injured. And 5 guys who were outside of the tank had traumatic hearing loss. Their inner ear basically exploded or tore. And amongst that, and the reason I tell this story was just to understand the leadership loss, we lost to that injury our Mempe, or company commander. We lost an officer and a number of soldiers as well. And we experienced another major injury, major issue to happen within your company. And we had already lost Tadmor, who was the deputy company commander, and we were just lacking in leadership. And I remember in that time feeling like everything was falling apart and how we just really needed a leader. In the meantime, Netzer Simchi, who had used to be our deputy company commander, he had to leave about a year before he had left our company because he also had hearing loss. Tanks are loud, angry machines, and they're not good for your body, and they're not good for your hearing, for sure. And Netzer decided that he didn't want to leave Tzahal, he wanted to stay and be involved, but he realized he couldn't do it anymore in the tanks. And so he decided to become the Kambatz, which is like the intelligence officer of the company. 4 months before that horrid day, Netzer got married. He was 4 months married, and he was in the middle of his honeymoon in Thailand with his wife, Koral. And when October 7th happened, he bought tickets, came home, got his uniform, and showed up. Like, it was obvious that Netzer would do. And Netzer ended up being in the loudest tank you could possibly imagine, the battalion commander's tank, because he needed to be privy to everything that was going on in every element, because he's in charge of the different operations that go out. And in the meantime, his hearing is becoming worse and worse. We check in with him every once in a while. I didn't get to see him that much in the first few months of the war. And to bring you back to the point of our company being kind of in shambles as far as leadership goes, we show up at a safe zone, relatively safe zone, in northern Gaza, and I get out of my tank, and before we've even parked, I see Netzer. And I'm so excited to see him. And as I'm getting out of the tank and I'm running up to him, I say, Netzer, what are you doing here? And he goes, I came to take over the company. I'll take you back a little bit on Netzer. Netzer I met 7 years ago. He was young, he was 23 years old. He had just gotten out of the army as an officer. And we had a we had a training session just for the commanders, and Netzer was a brand new officer into reserves. And in this all night, I'd call it a mission, but we didn't do anything. We were basically just parked, and Netzer had forgotten to bring a jacket. And so it was freezing, and he spent the whole night running sprints and shivering and laughing and smiling and making me laugh and making me smile. Netzer didn't have a lot of obstacles because he turned them all into easy walks in the park. Everything he did with such chen, with such smiles, and all he cared about were the people around him. That was just him. In fact, when he was on his way home and his family asked him, what's he going to do in the situation in the country, and he said, "Ze gadol alai, that's too big. Ani tzarich לעזור לאנשים שלי. I have to help my people, my friends. I have to be there, part of that." So Netzer had gone into the Shiva houses of Yair and Zechariah on a day where he should have been at home resting. And he showed up to the battalion commander at the end of that day, or the next day, I think it was. And he said, "I'm taking over the company." Ohad Foldo is the battalion commander. He said, in that moment, I hated him because I knew I was going to lose him. I knew he had to go do it, and I knew there was no stopping him. That's what he did. Netzer showed up, and like that, we had a leader. And it felt great. Every night, Netzer has the least amount of time of everybody. He's the Mempei, he's the company commander. On top of doing everything we have to do, we get back and we're able to rest for a few hours. Netzer goes to meetings. And at the end of all these briefs and these meetings and plans for tomorrow, Netzer shows up in a dark room, because we're in the middle of Gaza, you don't turn on lights. And he sits back and he starts every night, he tells the same story. It begins like this. As I understand it, in the history of our nation, whenever there's been a situation like this, it's not the big politicians, it's not the elevated, quote unquote, military leaders. It's the simple people in the field that make the decisions which make an impact on what eventually happens on the pathway to victory. Every night opens up like that. And then he has a very long drush on what we're going to be doing the next day. And it's longer than it needs to be, and it's as captivating as you can imagine. And we're listening, we're hanging on to every single word because we have a leader. And that lasted for about a week, and the moments before Netzer was killed, my tank got hit by an explosive device, and with a little bit of a different angle, things would have been different, but thank God my whole team was okay. I got hit in the face a little bit with like rocks, and almost no damage, thank God. And we were okay, but the tank was not okay. And we were stalled and we couldn't really move. And immediately as this happened, I realized we have to report what happened. And so I get on the comms, I get on the radio, and I say to Netzer, they shot at us from the east in this region, giving the report that I thought would be helpful for the situation. The response I got from Netzer is classic Netzer. He says, Josh, ma'im anashim? What about your people? Took me a moment to think. We're in the middle of an event. Shouldn't we be responding? And I realized, no, he's right. Get back on the kesher. Slicha, akulam beseder. To which he responds, okay, Josh, me'efo yaru alecha. Where did they fire from you? Where did they fire on you from? And the next point also emphasizes who Netzer was. I told him where they fired on us. I reminded him that there's troops, our troops, just right next door, so we can't fire back. He says, of course I know. And then he goes exactly there, because that's where he needs to be. And that's where Netzer fell in battle. We didn't know it at the time, but we learned it afterwards. I don't believe that any of them are not with us. But in that moment, I couldn't believe that we had lost our leader either. Which brings me back to the Kol HaShofar. I think that on a day like Yom HaZikaron, we hear more the Bechi, maybe. But I know for me, it was a tremendous zchut to know these people, to know Yair, to know Zechariah, to know Netzer. I know it was a tremendous zchut to fight alongside them. I know for them it was a tremendous zchut to defend their nation, to be there for their people. And I believe that there's going to be a day where that Kol HaShofar doesn't include any of the Bechi, or maybe the Bechi turns sweet. And ever since I've been kind of obsessing about this whole concept of Gvura. And that's what I've been involved in recently. In order to be a Gibor, Chazal teach us, means a Gibor, a Kovesh Yitzol, right? I've always thought that you think a Gibor is somebody who's strong and shows up to battle and displays no fear and is there for his comrades in arms. But a real Gibor is one Kovesh Yitzol. Today, I read it a little bit differently, and I think if you're somebody who's capable of conquering your urges, your Yetzil, then you can be someone who's there for your people, heroic, in battle, fearless, or acting within fear, but doing what you need to do. So I'm waiting for that Kol HaShofar, I'm waiting for the Mashiach Tzidkenu, I'm waiting for us to be back side by side. I won't take too much of their time, they're too precious, there's too many people, but I'd love a hug. And Yeh Zechram Baruch.